We're in our series of the minor prophets, and we're in the book of Hosea, and we're going to start in chapter 7 this morning. Hosea chapter 7. We've been kind of looking at a big picture approach in some ways in this book. Hosea is bringing really a judgment against Israel initially, but he also includes Judah in this. Judah's going to survive a little longer than Israel does before they go into captivity, but Hosea's got some warnings for them too, and we're going to see that actually a couple times within these next couple of chapters as well, in this conversation that God is having through the prophet with the people as to the reasonings why He's bringing judgment. What I appreciate about God in all these matters is that simply God doesn't just punish for punishment's sake. And when He brings down this kind of judgment, especially something this severe, when He's going to send them off into captivity, He wants them to understand exactly why that is. He wants them to understand the reasonings behind His decision to bring such a challenging judgment against them. He doesn't want them ignorant of what caused it. And so over these last several chapters, He's been having this conversation about the various conducts and choices and decisions that these folks have been making that has led Him to bring this condemnation down upon them. And in fact, here in chapter 7, at the very beginning of the chapter, if you will, notice that He even talks to them for a moment about how He may have or would have healed them or helped them. But He saw a particular tribe with the whole that was actually having a greater influence. Which one is it, by the way? We've already seen them. Ephraim, right? Ephraim seems to be the central point. I showed you on a map on Wednesday that they are the closest in some senses to Judah. They're the ones that are kind of sitting on the southern end of the northern tribes, and they seem to be the great influencer among those people, and they're seemingly leading them, even when there might be a glimmer of hope, maybe a thought that maybe they'll turn, but it seems like Ephraim is the one who seems to be the heavy influencer of them, away from Jehovah, away from God. And because of that, they kind of become the poster tribe, if you will, for the whole nation. And so there are moments where Ephraim is referenced specifically, moments where Ephraim is used to represent the whole, but they seem to be the catalyst for a lot of the difficulties and challenges that are going on. So when I would have healed the nation, I still saw the iniquity of Ephraim and the influence that was going on, and it was discovered. It's somewhat poetic language, by the way, because God, it's not like something had been hidden from Him, and then all of a sudden, I was going to help Him out, but I didn't know about this. The imagery really is somewhat poetic. I could have healed them. I was leaning towards that. But then when you look and see the evidence of their behavior, especially the influence of Ephraim, that simply couldn't happen. Ephraim was discovered, the wickedness of Samaria. For they commit falsehood, the thief cometh in, and the troop of robbers spoil without. And they consider not in their hearts that I remember all their wickedness. Now their own doings have beset them about. They are before my face. And so God says, I see it all. What caused this? Notice that phrase in the middle of verse 2. Now they're what? Their own doings. And God says, this isn't about me. And this isn't about my choices in this matter. This is about their own doings, their choices, their decisions. They're deciding to live in wickedness and difficulties. And they consider not in their own hearts or in their hearts that I remember all their wickedness. The longer you do wickedness and the longer you think you're getting away with it, what's the temptation? Yeah, God doesn't know, or God's not reacting. Nobody's going to understand these things. It's not going to be a problem. And we just kind of have this continuing mindset of how wickedness just continues to pervade, because they don't realize how exposed and how known they really are. They make the king glad with their wickedness and the princes with their lies. In other words, what? From the top? Yeah, top to the bottom, the wickedness is prevalent. In fact, when the people were engaged in their sinful practices, it actually made the kings and the princes what? It made them happy. They actually look down at the people and say, we've led them right where we want them to be. They're engaged and involved in the very things that we led them to be involved in. And so this is a nationwide, if you will, difficulty and problem. Israel is in difficulties because The leadership is leading them away from God and into wickedness, and they're following right along with him the whole way. And so they make the king glad with their wickedness, the princes with their lies. They are all adulterers as an oven heated by the baker, who ceaseth from raising after he hath kneaded the dough, until it be leavened. Now, it's interesting here with that baker and leavening, and so the baker might heat up the oven, right? But he can't just throw the dough immediately in the oven. He's got to let it leaven and rise, and so that takes what? Takes time. So over this span of time, in their minds, they're getting what? Yeah, they're getting away. We're getting away with it, right? We've already said they're getting away with it. But God says, well, remember, that oven's still being kept warm and hot, and your leavening is continuing potentially, but difficulties are on the rise, and just because you might not be baked in the oven at the moment, the baker knows when the time is to create that difficulty. The day of our king, the princes have made him sick with bottles of wine. He stretched out his hands with scorners, for they have made ready their heart like an oven. Whiles they lie in wait, their baker sleepeth all the night. In the morning it burneth as a flaming fire. And so to me, the imagery is God's fire is being stoked the whole time. And the oven's just getting hotter and hotter. And it's just a matter of time before the judgment comes. It's just a matter of time before he addresses this. They're not getting away with anything. They're only heaping greater troubles and difficulties to themselves. They're only creating a more challenging situation for themselves because of this. And so over time, the oven just gets hot. They are all hot as an oven and have devoured their judges. All their kings are fallen. There is none among them that calleth unto me. All this time has transpired. All this wickedness and sinful behavior continues to happen. And who haven't they reached out to during it all? God. No effort whatsoever to try to reach out to God, to try to find resolve and help and answer. There is none among them that calleth unto me or reaches out to God. This sin just keeps continuing to progress worse and worse. Ephraim, he hath mixed himself among the people. Ephraim is a cake not turned. Have you ever thrown some pancakes on a griddle and forget? Pay attention. What happens? One side is what? Burnt. What's the other side? It's raw. Okay? So one side's burnt, the other side's raw. They're being burned by what? Sin and wickedness, and they're raw towards God. They're a cake unturned. That's the imagery to me with that kind of description. All the while, they're willing to stay right on the hot coals the whole time, and sin is scorching them every step of the way, and they're just getting crispier and crispier, if you will, in terms of that cake being burnt by the fire. And all the while, the other side, if they would turn and reach out towards God and quit being raw towards Him, and then they could find answer and resolve and help and to make correct and turn from this situation. But he says, Ephraim's this cake unturned, as they refuse to recognize the situation they're in. Go ahead, Jim. Yeah. Yeah. And that imagery is seen here, I think, that they're just continuing to be cooked over time in the picture and remained distant from their Creator during it all. And eventually the consequence of that comes. Strangers have devoured his strength, and he knoweth it not. Yea, gray hairs are here and there upon him, yet he knoweth not. Time's coming and going. The gray hairs are setting in. The process of time is catching up to him. And he says, strangers have devoured his strength, and he knoweth it not. He's being weakened by his allegiances to anything and everything but God. He's making his covenants and his arrangements, whether it be with Egypt at times, whether it be with Assyria at times, or whoever it might be. He continues to make these allegiances with strangers in hopes that somehow that'll aid and help him through the difficulties, but he doesn't realize that he's not being benefited by those things at all. And the key really in all that is found in verse 10. What's the word? Pride. And the pride of Israel testifieth to his face. And they do not return to the Lord their God, nor seek him for all this. This isn't just a matter of being obstinate, by the way. Israel and the judgment that God is bringing against them isn't just because, and I mean, it's part of it, but this isn't just a matter of saying, I'm just not interested in God. They become, in some senses, very verbal and very directly in opposition to God. This isn't just a matter of not doing what God asked them to do. This is a matter of actually being defiant in His face and towards Him and directly towards Him. And that's what pride will do. Pride can build somebody up in their confidence level so much that they just decide that it doesn't matter what I say to Jehovah. I'm not going to be destroyed. I'm too strong for problems to occur. There's nothing He can do to me. These allegiances and covenants that I've built with these other nations are going to help me. And so this obstinate pride that is being created is actually giving them difficulties in their relationship with Jehovah, and even very blasphemously in some ways as they direct towards Him. Yeah, and they're obstinate towards. Right, and so they didn't start well, and it's no wonder that over time it's just progressively gotten worse. And yeah, and their connections with other nations. I was going to bring that in, but since you brought up, we'll go ahead and look at that. Go back to Exodus 34 with me for a minute. I wasn't sure exactly, to be honest with you, at what point I'd share this, but since Judy mentioned that, these strangers and this connection that they had made. And one of the things I want us to appreciate too is this wasn't, this idea of intermingling with the strangers, the other nations, and those kinds of intermarriages, and God forbid, that wasn't racial. And what I mean by that is this wasn't just about God not wanting them to go, and this was about what those marriages would bring in relationship to the gods that they worshipped and honored. And just notice it with me. Exodus 34, verse 12. Take to thyself, lest thou make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, whither thou goest. And by the way, this is when they're going to come into the promised land, right? The descriptions are going to happen. Whither thou goest, lest it be for a snare in the midst of thee. But ye shall destroy their altars, break their images, cut down their groves, for thou shalt no other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Lest thou make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they go whoring after their gods, and do sacrifice unto their gods, and one call thee, and thou eat of his sacrifice. And thou take of their daughters unto thy sons, and their daughters go whoring after their gods, and make thy sons go whoring after their gods. The issue was about what God knew would happen when they would begin to have these intermingled relationships and marriages where they were going to find wives and or husbands from other nations, that it was going to lead them and influence them to begin to worship and to honor other gods. Now, sure, there's a lineage that needs to bring about Jesus. I get that aspect of it as well. And there's a heritage that needs to occur. All that's understood. But God's concern about these strangers in Hosea's writings and these intermingled relationships and marriages seems to be from the early goings about the fact that they would lead them away from Jehovah into idolatry. Guess what? It's exactly what happened. That's exactly what happened. They refused this responsibility. They refused this information and knowledge that God shared with them. He told them ahead of time, the minute you begin to do that, those sons and those daughters from those other nations are going to begin to influence you. And they're going to lead you to work towards their gods and their idolatries and their methods of worship. And that's exactly what happened because of that. Who was the greatest offender, by the way, of that? Who would jump? Maybe let me rephrase that. Who jumps out in your mind? Solomon, right? Solomon seemed to have wives from everywhere, and because of that, he's building altars to their gods everywhere, and it created a pretty serious difficulty. And Solomon, by the way, is only how many kings in? 3. He's the third. And right after him is chaos and division that comes. But he's already set the stage. His behaviors and choices had already set the stage for what Israel and, in since Judah would become because of his decisions and choices that he had made. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, Kim, that here's the sobering reality that just needs to be to accept in honesty. And this isn't really a conversation. Sometimes this conversation kind of gets into that, well, are they lawfully allowed to marry, somebody who's not a Christian? And that's not really the conversation. The conversation needs to be about, are we recognizing the dangers if somebody has zero interest whatsoever in the Creator? How challenging that will be in the strongest bond known to man on earth, the marriage bond, and how challenging that can be. God knew it then, what was going to happen, especially because of their heavy that they would bring. And so it's fair warning. And though we may not have the same kind of explicit instructions under the New Testament law that they had under the Old Testament law, because the nations are different, the physical nation, spiritual nation, the church, but the warning still is understood that if we interconnect ourselves with those who are maybe even have already shown to us that they're going to try to lead us away from our spiritual mindset, then that ought to send red flags and warnings to us that we might want to be cautious about those decisions. Yeah, and I could illustrate that, but I'd get in trouble. But if I brought somebody up here and I stood on top of this table, even as big as I am, I could bring the smallest person in the room, and you'd probably have an easier time pulling me down to the floor than I would have pulling you up on top of the table, right? It's always easier to drag somebody down than it is to pull somebody up. Now, don't try that at home or here, but it's an illustration. Go ahead, Randy. Yeah. 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 And you're right, Randy. Societally, and I think that's in societal influences. We're kidding ourselves if we don't think societal influences don't have an effect on the church. I mean, that there's too much evidence to illustrate that it does. And I think that one of those societal influences is, to what you're saying, is we're very rare to ever hear somebody say, I did that. I'm responsible. I did that. What we hear is, if you were offended by that, if you thought that was bad, if you understand what I'm saying? We deflect all the time. And what we're really saying is, you really shouldn't have been upset about that. But since you were, I'll throw you a token apology. But it's not an admission that what I did was wrong. And that's where the pride kicks in. Is we don't want to accept accountability and responsibility for our actions. And because of that, it may seem benign necessarily at the outset, but look what it progresses to. Here's biblical illustration of what it progresses to. They go from maybe just saying, well, I don't think this will hurt. What's it matter whether I'm not any great leader in the nation? What's it matter if I go take a wife from this other nation? You know, we have those kinds of conversations, but the truth is, these things are leading you to absolute obstinance towards God eventually, is where they ended up. Yeah. 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 And we see it here. That's exactly what God is saying to them. He has said repeatedly in Hosea's prophecy that they had reached a point where God says, I'm stepping back from this because you all have made your decision, you've made your choices, and you've so hardened yourself towards me that even if you wanted to seek me, you won't find me, because they had so distanced themselves. And so these ought to be glaring warnings to us about what can happen in the condition of man. And that's the lesson to me, these prophets, as we study them. Go ahead, Jim. Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. How long were they in Egypt? 400 years. Yeah. They left physical Egypt. They didn't leave Egypt. And it seemed to be a progressive problem even throughout their history. And it was, in their minds, maybe a safe place to run. We're going to see it in the next chapter. In chapter 8, I believe, we're going to see where he warns them about thinking that when this judgment comes, that they'll be able to escape just by running down into Egypt. He's going to warn Israel and Judah both about that mindset. But they had held on to those long, and the Egyptian culture was a heavy influencer in those times. I don't know how to best illustrate it to you, but in some senses, we have that today. Sometimes we'll talk about the Western culture affecting in the Eastern and Middle Eastern cultures are getting frustrated when the Western cultures begin to influence them, and that happens. And I'm not trying to talk political. I'm just trying to talk example that nations can influence other nations, and Egypt was a great influencer among those nations. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And there was some refuge and security, and again, they, in their part, in the days of Hosea, they weren't turning to God. So where else are you going to have to turn? If you need help, you got to turn to these other nations. They weren't going to turn to God. There's too much pride in them. Yeah. Yeah. It's still a negative influencer. Any other thoughts? Yeah. 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 And maybe if we got the cart and the horse in the right positions, if we had a greater responsibility and accountability to God, then we would have appreciated greater responsibility to those around us as well. Don't mention the next verse, verse 11. Ephraim also was like a silly dove, without heart. They call to Egypt. They go to Assyria. He basically saying, well, they'll just flap their wings and fly to wherever, right? They have no heart. And what other word might you think of in this context? They don't have any heart. They're just a silly dove that just flips from one thing to the next thing to the next thing to the next thing. And they have no sense, or they don't have no conviction. There's no commitment. There's no conviction about them. One minute it's Egypt that's going to help us. The next minute it's Assyria. It's going to help us. The next minute it's another nation that's going to help us. The next thing. And they're just like a silly dove fluttering from one thing to the next thing to the next thing, never stopping and pausing, considering that the great answer was where? Sitting on the throne, right? It was God, the God of heaven. And they were just going anywhere and everywhere, and trying to fix their problems by seeking that help in all the wrong locations. But God says, when they shall go, I will do what? In verse 12. I spread my net upon them. I will bring them down as the fowls of the heaven. I will chastise them as their congregation hath heard. You might think, and maybe in their mind is, if we keep moving, right? We move from this place to this place to this thought, that we can somehow just stay out ahead of God's judgment. But God says, you can fly around wherever you want, silly dove, but my net will catch you. When it's time for the judgment to come, my net will befall them. Woe to you, for they have fled from me. Destruction unto them, because they have transgressed against me. Though I have redeemed them, yet they have spoken lies against me. I help them, and they act like what? Or God, you didn't help us. What do you mean? I've redeemed them. I've bought them out of bondage and set them free from the things that were, and they speak lies against me about what God actually has done or not done. It's interesting that as a nation they had reached a point where not only were they in disbelief, if you will, about what God had actually done and aided them and helped them in, but they've gone as far now as just to speak absolute lies about what God had done or not done. They're willing to just speak out against Him very directly because of that. And they have not cried unto me with their heart. When they howled up upon their beds, they assemble themselves for corn and wine, and they rebel against me. I have bound and strengthened their arms, yet do they imagine mischief against me. I help them, and they imagine ways to disconnect and create problems in this relationship. I strengthen them, they ignore that I was the benefit to them. They celebrate among themselves, but give no credit and benefit to them, to God. They return, but not to the Most High. They are like a deceitful bow. Their princes shall fall by the sword for the rage of their tongue. This shall be their derision in the land of Egypt. And so, God says they're like a bow that never shoots straight. They've become someone who always thinks that if I I'll shoot this arrow, and if I shoot towards Egypt, that's going to, if I shoot toward wherever it is. But he says they never really seem to accomplish the things that they're setting out to do. And the only reason for that is because they never turn to Jehovah in that process. Yeah. And I think that there's an image of they may throw token thoughts at him. They may cry at night, oh, why aren't you helping us? But they have no real conviction or commitment or heart about what they're crying out for. Yeah, I think that's true in that text. Yeah. 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 Without commitment, they brought things rather than themselves, and I think that's a challenge that the biblical narrative shares with us throughout history of man. That where often when people become disconnected from God, they can do things or offer Him things in order to correct that situation. Whereas it's always demanded, whether it's Old or New Testament or when you're reading, it's always about giving of themselves before God as the real answer and the real strength that will come in that relationship. Well, I think that he their mindset is if we can get to Egypt, we can find security. Even if God brings a judgment, even if from the north, remember where Egypt is in relationship to them, but even if an enemy from the north comes down and begins to conquest the land, we'll just run to Egypt and we'll find refuge and safety. It'll all be okay. And he says, you're like a bow. You think you're going to shoot straight and Egypt's the answer and you're going to hit the target. But he says, you'll just become a derision in Egypt as well. This judgment's coming no matter where you run. And that seems to be the imagery to me. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's going to be an interesting circumstance, and Egypt's not going to be quite the favorable situation that these folks think that it's going to be. And it's not because of Egypt necessarily, but because God's judgment's coming like a net, whether they think they can outrun it or not. Any other thoughts, comments about chapter 7? And they don't reach out to Him with any heart or conviction about Him when they do, either. Yeah, yeah, not. Yeah, and they had been doing that for a long time. Yeah, 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 and that creates a difficulty for anybody. Jehovah. All right, we only have a couple minutes, but let's run to chapter 8 for just a couple of moments here. So he says, set the trumpet to thy mouth. He shall come as an eagle against the house of the Lord, because they have transgressed my covenant and trespassed against my law. When the judgment finally comes, and when the enemy that God will use against them to come down and bring this judgment against them, it's going to be swift, is the appearance to me. In other words, what do you use trumpet for? Warning, right? And so he says this is going to come like an eagle swooping down on its prey. It's going to be swift and sudden. And you better have the trumpet to your right. You don't put it over in a corner and have to go run and grab it. You'll never get the alarm off. That's the imagery here. This is going to come so swiftly and so quickly when it arrives that it'll be like an eagle swooping down. And you better, if you think you're going to give a warning, you better have that trumpet right to your lips all the time, ready, because there's not going to be any moment for you to be able to call out a warning because you've transgressed the covenant, you've trespassed against the law. Israel shall cry unto me, my God, we know thee. Is that true? It depends on how you answer, right? They knew of Him, but they didn't know Him anymore. Their knowledge of who Jehovah was and what He was supposed to be to them and how He should have been appreciated and honored, but they'll cry out. Israel hath cast off the thing that is good. The enemy shall pursue them. They have set up kings, but not by me. They have made princes, and I knew it not. Of their silver and their gold have they made them idols, that they may be cut off. Let's stop thinking a minute. Who prospered them? God did. God prospered them, and so that pile of silver and gold came because of prosperity God had aided and allowed them to receive. They turned the prosperity that God offered unto them and made an idol out of it. I mean, you talk about the ultimate insult. To take the benefits that somebody else has offered unto you and, in a sense, turn it against that very being by creating idols out of that silver and gold. And yet, we may not craft a golden calf or a silver trinket of something that we're bowing down to on a daily basis. But the truth is, there are times where we can take the prosperity of God. We absorb the blessings and benefits that God is providing for us, and we turn an obstinate approach towards Him, or we act as if He didn't do that, I did that, I earned that, I gained this benefit, my success is what's prospered me. And we can be, in some senses, just as obstinate towards God and the blessings that He provides. And thy calf, O Samaria, hath cast thee off. Mine anger is kindled against them. How long will it be ere they attain to innocency? It's interesting imagery when you think about it. He says, the calf, thy calf, O Samaria, has what? Your gods have what? Yeah, you trusted this golden calf that you fashioned, and you've trusted these idols that you've formed, and you've put all your reliance upon these things, and here comes the judgment of the Jehovah God, and you're going to recognize that those gods were nothing. They've casted you aside with no ability to help or aid. How long will it be ere they attain to innocency? For from Israel was it also, the workman made it. Therefore it is not God, but the calf of Samaria shall be broken in pieces. It didn't come from Jehovah. It didn't come from the Creator. This was something they had fashioned and they created for themselves. And those things will be brought to destruction. For you've sown to the wind, but you've reaped what? The whirlwind. Not a pleasant experience, right? And you thought that maybe this will be okay, and we've sown to the wind, but here comes the whirlwind instead. You've thrown out the seed, if you will, and thought that the wind would just carry it exactly where it needed to, but the whirlwind comes, and it hath no stalk. The bud shall yield no meal. If so be it yield, the stranger shall swallow it up. And so, if by chance, the crops really aren't going to come, but if by chance they do, they're going to be devoured by those who come and inhabit the land and take over that place. And so these difficulties that they've created for themselves ultimately come back to bring the harm and difficulty and the judgment that is coming. Israel was swallowed up. Now shall they be among the Gentiles as a vessel wherein is no pleasure. And so all the while they think that everything's good, right? We're building these allegiances, and we've got Egypt, we've got Assyria, we've got all these places that are going to just protect us and help us and give us place of refuge, but there's consequence coming to them, even among those Gentile nations that they had thought would aid and help them. All right, so next Sunday, prayer night Wednesday, so next Sunday we'll come back, continue to look at the book of Hosea here.